there is a new regulation in Europe, in European Union. It's called the JCA, or Joint Clinical Assessment. It is quite new. It actually went into effect January this year. And the goal of that assessment is to speed up the launch of new pharmaceutical drugs across 27 member states. And so this is a great thing, because as a pharmaceutical company, and I worked for over 25 years for several of those, we tend to create what we call a launch sequence, and pharmaceutical companies tend to launch one country at a time, so in a certain order. And what that means to patients with cancer, it means that if you live in one of those priority countries, or first wave of countries that pharmaceutical companies launch, you're going to get the drugs faster than some other countries. And so if you live in Greece, Portugal, Slovenia, this is just names of the countries, right? You may not get the drugs for years, because the priority is going to be Germany. Always the priority was UK, and even now with the Brexit, still UK and Germany, large markets, right? So what JCA wanted to accomplish, they said, in order to get a drug reimbursed, you need to answer several questions after the drug has been approved by a regulatory authority. And maybe not everybody knows that, but when a pharmaceutical company creates a portfolio, a file for the drug, they need to prove that the drug is effective, as well as safe, and can be manufactured consistently. So there's 3 things you have to prove to get the drug into the world, approved by the regulators. Now, what regulators do not look at all is how much is this drug, and do we need another option in a certain disease. They believe you always need another option, as long as your options is efficacious versus some type of standard care or control, and you can manufacture it, and the efficacy and safety balance is there, so that it brings more good than harm, then the drug is going to be approved. And then comes individual country budgets, because can we now afford that drug? How much should we pay for that drug, considering what we currently use and how much it's costing us now? And it is a very important topic, of course, because we don't have unlimited money. Countries don't have unlimited money. And yes, it is very country specific. But in that process comes several steps. And it's actually 3 steps process. First step is they have to look at what they call comparative effectiveness. Because when you file with the regulatory authority, you often can compare to placebo, which is a sugar pill, which is nothing or no treatment. Or you could choose a standard care that may not be a standard care in this specific country, because each country, based on their reimbursement practices and based on their clinical practices, may have variations. So the truth is, their established standard of care for that specific patient subset may be different. So when a pharmaceutical company got their drug approved and the European regulators said, okay, this is good enough, okay, because versus this one other comparator, it showed that it works, right? We just wanted to make sure it works. But is this better now than something else that just launched last year? Often that question is not answered, because the clinical trials take years. And that comparator in the clinical trials is very, very often not the comparator that recently entered the market, right? So the first questions that the payers need to answer is this better than what I already have? Okay, that's the first question. That's called comparative effectiveness. That usually requires complicated statistical analysis or simulations. We try often to simulate using statistical models. So that's not AI, by the way. I know we live in a world of AI. This has existed. This is statistics. You try to compare one drug to another drug to answer the question, is this better if these drugs were to be compared in a clinical trial in the same population? So you need to ensure you're not comparing apples to oranges, or sometimes apples to bunnies, I say completely different things, right? You need to make sure that these studies are comparable. And then when you do that, then you compare them. And before you can do that, you need to know what you need to compare to. So what is a standard of care in each of these countries? So that takes a lot of time. The following steps after you establish comparative effectiveness and you know which is a better drug and how much better it is, you measure it somehow. In oncology, we measure it in survival, who lives longer, or progression, who lives longer until the disease gets worse, right? And the patient is no longer in the same quality of life. So once this is done, then you start adding monetary terms, because you're going to say, well, this is this much better. How much more am I willing to pay for this much better? That is very country specific, because countries have different economies. We know GDPs are different in each country. So what this new law, I am back to the law, the JCA decided to do, they said, well, part 1, comparative effectiveness, is not different country to country. Yes, the comparators might be different, but gathering that evidence is the same. So they said, we're going to take over the first part and we're going to do it jointly as Europe. Okay, we're going to decide whether this drug is better than everything else we have. And then countries could do their budget themselves, decide how much they're willing to pay, and those negotiations. So they did it to speed up the process. But for pharmaceutical company, it's actually a very big headache, because if before you had time, you did this country first, and then you adopted what you did for this country. You said, oh, let's change it around. Let's change it for France. Oh, let's change it a bit for Italy. We keep twisting, we're making variations for each country. Then now they don't have that luxury of time. They have to come up with one submission that satisfies 27 member states on comparative effectiveness. And to do this, they are required to run a very, very large systematic literature review across all 27 country member states, because they want to know which therapies has proven efficacious in this specific patient population. And of these therapies, which are in the guidelines, in the local guidelines for each of those 27 countries, and which are reimbursed, which means available, and basically are. So they need to understand what is a standard of care for this specific patient population, because as I mentioned, treatment practices are different. So it's a very large project to conduct that. And not only is it large, but we need to keep it up to date. We need to keep it current, because as you're preparing for that submission, and then you're finally ready to submit, and if a few months passed, you may have a new drug that is now been approved and that changed the treatment pattern. So you need to be currently vigilant about new treatments releasing new information that is valid, that is robust, that has come from the clinical trials that has been conducted and designed with a comparator arm and so forth, and then you also need to know what is happening to the guidelines. All big guidelines, like from American Society of Clinical Oncology and NCCN, ESMO, European Society of Medical Oncology guidelines, but also local guidelines. You need to know. And also local reimbursement authorities. Did they review the drug? Did they make a recommendation? Did they come to an agreement with other pharmaceutical companies to reimburse and to add this drug to the practice? So this is an enormous size of the evidence that needs to be kept in top shape and up to date. And you can't keep doing this. You have to have a database that is always up to date, where with few clicks you could say, well, what's in France for these patients? What's in Spain for these patients? Because then once you understand what is going to be your comparator or comparators, multiple drugs in that specific jurisdiction, then the fun part starts and you need to do the analysis, that complicated. I mean, I'm an economist and I get excited about these kind of analysis, because you create a virtual universe, right? In which these drugs could have been compared. I love this, right? It's like AI people games, right? You create a virtual reality in which these, heroes met and fought. Okay, this is what we do. We're like this. We're magicians who create the virtual universe in which these drugs meet, right? But before you can do the fun part, you have to do the tedious part of gathering all the evidence, and you are supposed to do it following a protocol that must be transparent to the point that if an authority wants to repeat it, they have to look at your search string, and if they run it, they will get the same result. It has to be transparent and repeatable. They should be able to run that. Now, none of that exists in the chatbot universe, where you don't know where the information comes from and who decides what and who decides why this is a study or that is a study, or it's an easy life when you just get an answer. You don't know where it came from. Now, that doesn't work in the regulatory environment where the strong decisions would be made. So the JCA, it is a very important regulation, because hopefully this means for countries that are not used to be in the first wave of launches, they may be able to get their drug sooner accessible to that. And patients in Europe no longer have to travel to a different country. I hear this a lot from patients in cancer, that they tell me, oh, but I had to go for treatment to a different country because they have different treatment practices, different guidelines, and I could get that drug there. I cannot get it in my country. So that's the whole point. The point is, can we make the drugs available